Can I remind members, visitors and those in the public gallery to please ensure their mobile phones are switched off or in airplane mode for the duration of this meeting, as they interfere with the broadcasting equipment even when on silent mode. And we are now moving to the discussion regarding the impact and opportunities in relation to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I'd like to welcome Ms. Darina Allen, Slow Food Ireland, Mr. Eoin Bradley, Irish Cancer Society, Ms. Lorna Gold, Trocaire, and Mr. Barry Finnegan, Attac Ireland, to the meeting to discuss the impacts and opportunities in relation to TTIP. Before we commence, in accordance with procedure, I am required to read the following. By virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible, you shouldn't criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd like to remind our guests that the presentation should be no more than 5 minutes in duration, and members have been circulated with the presentations submitted by today's attendees, and I'll be keeping you to your 5 minutes. So now I'd like to invite Ms. Darina Allen to make her presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm wearing not just the Slow Food hat, but actually also some others, Taste Council of Ireland and Eurotoke and Good Food Ireland, all those hats as well when I speak. So, and thank you for the opportunity. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP as is referred to, this agreement poses a serious threat to well-regulated Irish and European food industry. One of the objectives of the TTIP negotiations is to achieve mutual recognition and harmonisation of food standards between America and Europe. Nobody could really argue against that, but it's the devil, of course, is in the detail. The organisations that I speak of reject these proposals. The following are some of the areas that we express serious concerns about. The European Commission's stated TTIP negotiating position is to abandon the precautionary principle. This is the system whereby chemicals and pesticides used in our food system must be proven to be safe for animal and human health prior to use. In the US, the reverse is the case. Many carcinogenic and endocrine disrupting chemicals are used in food production there that are banned in Europe. The proposed TTIP mutual recognition system means we would no longer be able to ban these chemicals. EU regulations currently require measures along the whole chain of production to guarantee the safety of the final product. While the US system mostly verifies the safety of the end product and is therefore prone to resorting to pathogen reduction treatments. For example, instead of preventing chickens getting infected with pathogens during all stages of rearing and slaughter, the poultry industry there resorts to dipping the chickens in chlorine to eliminate bacteria at the end of the meat production chain. Again, the harmonisation of food standards proposed in TTIP would make it impossible to maintain our standards and continue to ban the import of such foods. With more chemical inputs and higher capital costs of production than in Europe, the US factory food system produces food at a lower unit cost and will therefore create unfair competition. In the US, growth hormone-injected beef and dairy herds lead to lower unit costs in the price sold to consumers and also to lower quality meat and the associated human and animal health implications. While only those using intensive farming methods and liberal use of antibiotics are able to stay in business. The objective of TTIP is to allow not only US unlabelled hormone-injected beef to be sold in Europe, but also to allow the sale of unlabelled American GMO, genetically modified organism products as well. All existing food regulations not explicitly overturned in TTIP and all future higher and improved standards of food regulation will be subject to being overturned by a proposed quasi-judicial system of arbitration called ISDS, or Investor State Dispute Settlement. Now, the Commission has declared they would prefer not to have this now in TTIP. They'd rather replace it with the new ISDS, which they call ICS. the investor court system. And this ICS, as envisaged by the Commission, is almost exactly the same as the old ISDS, except that all the people who act as arbitrators would have to be qualified to practice as judges in the EU before they are considered qualified to act as arbitrators in the new ICS. And the second, the new ICS would have an appeal system, which is a new idea. And Barry will explain to you why nothing much has changed in that, actually, in a few moments. The EU-US proposal for TTIP is to establish this new legal system just for foreign investors so that they can bypass the Irish, European and American judicial systems when they feel that their current or future profits are being infringed. Are being infringed upon as a result of vague, ill-determined government actions such as, quote, unnecessarily restrictive barriers to trade or, quote, overly meddlesome barriers to trade. This will include everything from what constitutes organic food standards to correct labelling, to correct labelling and also highlighting food allergy contents on labelling. So who'd benefit from this agreement? Well, it certainly wouldn't be the consumers who will see food information further weakened over longer food supply chains, nor will it be the large majority of small-scale producers serving local markets who make up the societal and economic fabric of quality food production, the guardians of the environment and food traditions. So it seems that TTIP will give the rights to corporations to sue governments over decisions that may harm their potential profit margins. There are many examples of this already. As a result of a new law being introduced, they will be able to do this through this investor state dispute settlement mechanism, where cases are held in private and corporations can sue governments using this system, but governments can't sue corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Allen. Now I'd like to invite Ms Gold and Mr Finnegan to make the presentation. I think you're sharing the 5 minutes, are you?
We are,
yeah.
Thank you. Both Trocaire and Attac welcome this opportunity provided by the Joint Committee on Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation to represent the deep concerns that Trocaire, Attac and many other civil society organisations across the world with whom we are collaborating share about the potential impacts of TTIP, specifically in relation to policy space for human development, the right to regulate and climate change mitigation. Whilst TTIP covers a vast agenda, myself and Barry will keep our remarks to 3 main areas which Barry will outline. We strongly believe that TTIP, if taken as a blueprint for international trade, is in direct contradiction with the Sustainable Development Goals for enhanced representation and the voice of developing countries in decision-making in global, international, economic and financial institutions. It also contradicts the provisions in the Lisbon Treaty, which require the EU to ensure that its policies are coherent with its human development policies. Our key message is that there are already existing significant power imbalances between the capacity of states to meet their duty to protect citizens from human rights abuses by third parties and the resources of transnational corporations and the scope and impact of their operations. This is particularly the case in developing countries, but not exclusively so. These power imbalances would become even more deeply entrenched if the core elements of TTIP, such as the investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, as already referred to by Darina, are not challenged and overcome. State capacity and policy space to deal with urgent concerns, the most pressing of which I would say is climate change, which will have an impact on everyone, but particularly on the poorest people, would be undermined by TTIP. The 3.8 million EU citizens who have signed a self-organised European Citizens Initiative against TTIP also recognise these risks. My colleague Barry Finnegan from Attac will now outline some of the key concerns in more detail.
Thank you. And so the European Commission position is to make the TTIP the gold standard, was what they call the gold standard for future bilateral, plurilateral and multilateral trade agreements. This directly contradicts the stated objectives of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which, quote, ensure enhanced representation and voice of developing countries in decision-making in global, international and economic financial institutions. This means the two are incompatible, and it is implausible to believe that this aim of the Sustainable Development Goals could be implemented when developing countries who have absolutely no hand or part in the creation of the TTIP would be expected then to adhere to its so-called standards. The European Commission then goes on in terms of trade diversion to state that we want to create a user-friendly rules that guarantee that products benefiting from TTIP really are produced in Europe and the USA, and they make sure that goods, quote, goods from other countries do not enjoy the same benefits. Again, this is contradictory to the stated objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's an element of policy incoherence in that the EU seek to take account of development objectives in all of its policies that are likely to affect developing countries. However, its Trade and Sustainable Development paper published in relation to TTIP quite explicitly states that it only expects countries to adhere to the International Labour Organization standards of work that they have already signed up to. America has not even signed up to the basic 8 principles and standards of work of the United Nations International Labour Organization, and it is with them that we are proposing this trade deal. In terms of the background then, the Sustainable Development Goals objectives, which replace the Millennium Development Goals, commit countries to ending poverty in all its forms everywhere and to strengthen the means and implementation and revitalise the global partnership for sustainable development. Again, it is impossible to introduce legislation to force companies to reduce fossil fuel reduction if we introduce this proposed TTIP. Now, the European Commission held an online submissions for citizens in Europe, and it was the most popularly submitted consultation process they ever did, with 150,000 submissions. They very clearly summarise our concerns and say that in these submissions, say the Commission, the ISDS mechanism is perceived as a threat to democracy and public finance or to public policies. It is also considered as unnecessary between the EU and the US in view of the perceived strength of the respective judicial systems. They go on to summarise our views by saying that such views are largely echoed by most of the trade unions, a large majority of NGOs, government institutions and many respondents in the other organisations category, including consumer organisations. Many among the collective submissions expressed specific concerns about governments being sued by corporations for high amounts of money, which in their view will create a chilling effect on the right to regulate. In addition, certain replies from trade unions expressed a generic mistrust with regard to the independence and impartiality of the arbitrators, or are concerned that ISDS will create a possibility for investors to circumvent domestic courts, laws or regulations. I couldn't agree more. This is exactly the point that civil society is making. I have a list of examples of successful cases where governments have been forced to remove environmental regulations, etc., and I can go through them later. The other thing it does is that it locks in existing laws in terms of the ratchet clauses, and it will lock in existing climate change regulation and bar any future increases. Indeed, the United States of America is currently being sued by a company called TransCanada because of the American government's decision to drop the proposal for the Keystone Pipeline, the objective of which and they're basically saying that it was the only reason the American government is doing this is to stop climate change, and they're planning to sue for $15 billion. Suffice to say that
You'll have plenty of opportunity as
we go through
these. Mr. Bradley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted to be here today on behalf of the Irish Cancer Society to present to you our concerns and the concerns of the public health community on the current negotiations on TTIP. Let me begin by emphasising a few points. The Irish Cancer Society is not anti-trade, anti-EU or anti-US. We are for fewer people getting cancer and those who get cancer to have the best chance of survival after treatment. We want to see a trade agreement that protects the right of the Irish government to produce and implement public health policies without the interference of multinational corporations. And we here should know about such interference. As a country that is currently fighting global tobacco companies in the domestic courts, we feel that it's important that no additional opportunity be given to such companies to block, amend and delay policies that will reduce the cancer rate. In July 2015, the Irish Cancer Society commissioned Dr. Joshua Curtis of the London School of Economics and Dr. John Reynolds of the Maynooth University to examine the potential impact of the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, on Irish public health policy. In their conclusion, they say that public health policies, such as plain packaging, could be under serious threat if an ISDS is included in the final agreement. Ireland is well used to battling with tobacco companies in the forecourts. However, ISDS would allow these companies to bypass the domestic court system. It's a tactic that the tobacco industry is increasingly using. In 2012, global tobacco companies sued Australia for the introduction of plain packaging there on the grounds that it infringed intellectual property. The domestic courts found in favour of the Australian government because, and this is very important, public health trumps the rights of the tobacco industry. The tobacco companies lost, and they lost spectacularly. They were even forced to pay the costs to the Australian government. However, having lost this case, Philip Morris International, which manufactures brands such as Marlboro, used an ISDS mechanism in a little-known bilateral investment treaty between Australia and Hong Kong in order to sue the Australian government. The company even deliberately restructured their Asian business in order to justify the case. The case took 3 years and cost the Australian government an estimated 50 million Australian dollars. That's around 30 million euro. The Irish Cancer Society report on TTIP makes a number of recommendations and is designed to offer constructive suggestions in relation to the final agreement, one of which is that ISDS be taken out of the final agreement. Ireland is currently subject to just one minor ISDS clause within an energy charter, and the fact that we are the fourth largest destination for US foreign direct investment questions the argument that this is essential to trade and development in this country. The Irish Cancer Society commissioned research on 1,000 adults just before Christmas, and it found that fewer than 1 in 5 Irish people are actually aware of TTIP. 46% agreed in principle with the deal that sought to boost trade, but when they were informed that under a similar trade agreement Australia was sued by a tobacco company, 47% were concerned it would prevent Ireland from introducing their own new public health measures. And this figure rose to 70% among those who were initially aware of TTIP. One in 3 people surveyed also believe that TTIP definitely needs to be reformed in order to limit the opportunities for multinational companies to sue the Irish government. Again, this rises to 55% among those who were initially aware of TTIP. The Society has had very fruitful discussions with the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, as well as the European Commission. Now, while we welcome the plans by Commissioner Cecilia Malmström to replace ISDS and her comments that cases such as the Australian case on plain packaging won't happen under TTIP, the Society wants to see this made explicitly clear in any final agreement. If there is any element of TTIP that is subject to interpretation or allows public health law to be challenged, big industry will seize upon it. Should the investment court system go ahead, the Society is asking for public health laws to be excluded from the threat of ISDS. This idea is not without precedent. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, negotiations concluded in November includes a specific carve-out that stops the global tobacco industry from suing countries for introducing measures to curb smoking. The significance of the inclusion of this provision in TPP cannot be overstated, and we believe that this now sets the minimum benchmark for the final TTIP agreement. Ultimately, we believe that the Irish Government should be seeking, as a minimum, a carve-out of all public health policies. We believe that this is a proactive approach that reflects our position as a global leader in public health initiatives. To offer on a plate the opportunity to sue the Irish Government for introducing policies that will save lives is extremely short-sighted. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Bradley.
Gur míle mágad a chaithfirlaigh agus gur míle mágad féanas teachtain seo aniu agus the cuid fíneise. I greatly welcome the evidence that you've provided with us today. One of my greatest fears with regards to TTIP is the complete secrecy in which the process is being carried out and the lack of debate and information amongst the general public with regards to this. And the first question I would ask you, I know that the European Commission has met with about 600 different lobbyist groups throughout Europe. I believe about 88% of those have been private companies lobbying the EU. Have any of your organisations had that opportunity to sit in front of the European Commission and discuss your fears and details with regards to that? There's also this talk about that TTIP is going to be a major boon to Irish enterprise and to jobs, etc. But if you look at the CEPR study, it indicated that 10 times more benefit would go to FDI rather than small businesses, and actually 6 of the 8 areas in which they discussed would have a negative effect on small Indigenous businesses. And just to get maybe Ms Allen's perspective with regards to business and how TTIP is going to affect small business there. The key issue they talk about in TTIP is non-tariff barriers, and for that I read standards. And my worry is that in workers' rights standards, with regards to environmental standards, with regards to health and safety standards, we're not going to see an upward shift towards a common denominator, but we're actually going to focus on a lowest common denominator. And maybe if you could talk as well about what elements of those standards convergence is within TTIP and what is outside of TTIP, because we heard recently the European Commission scuppered plans for tight control over pesticides due to the fact that the US officials were seeking this common denominator when it came to standards as well. And just with regards the ISDS mechanism, it seems to me that this particular trade agreement is a radical shift in the balance between the power of 1, states and corporations, but 2, people themselves and corporations, and how that can affect. I'm just, maybe for Trocaire, if you could look at, I'm very concerned that the countries, especially the developing countries, which are locked outside of this agreement, will be at a disadvantage in many ways, because they'll be looking in. And you know, is there any way you could quantify the material effect to those countries with regards TTIP as well? And maybe if we could address those, and if I have a couple of minutes later, some of the answers I might give a supplementary.
Thank you, Deputy. Ms Allen, would you like to come in?
There were a lot of points made there, but just to talk about the jobs growth, which was one of the original the Commission. This was one of the big arguments that was made for TTIP, at this stage, the movement against TTIP, or that have concerns about TTIP, have demonstrated successfully that the economic model that was used to calculate job growth from TTIP is based on a series of impractical assumptions. For example, that a person who loses their job in the beef industry and in beef farming in Ireland would, at no cost overnight, move to a job at a chemical plant in Germany. For example, and that the Commission's own independent research shows at best case scenario of 1/20th of 1% rise per year in economic growth after full TTIP implementation. And that's really negligible. Would you like to take some of the other points, Barry, there?
Trocaire or the County Society, which of you would like to come in first?
I'm going to let Barry answer on behalf of Trocaire.
Okay, that's great. Mr Finnegan.
Yes, it's important to realise that while we're talking about TTIP, other trade agreements that are exactly like TTIP have already been finished. The EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, the EU-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, and the EU-Canada Free Trade Agreement, CETA. All of these are finished. They contain ISDS. They have the same threat to standards. They have the same threats to food safety. They have the same threats to worker standards. They also contain the ISDS. And so even if we scrap TTIP, any American company could set up an office in Singapore, Vietnam or Canada, and all of our fears about TTIP will become real through these agreements. On May 13th, the Council of Ministers of the European Union will be asked to vote on the text of the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, the CETA, between the EU and Canada. The European Commission is convinced that this is what they call an exclusive competence trade deal, which means that there's absolutely no need to have a vote in any of the 28 Member State parliaments. In order for the 28 Ministers of Trade to disagree with this, there must be unanimity among all 28 trade ministers. I find it very unlikely that that's going to happen. There will be a qualified majority vote on the 13th of May. The CETA, with the ISDS, will be approved by qualified majority vote, representing 16 countries, representing 65% of the population. The European Parliament will then be asked to vote on the text, probably before the end of July. This is where we must focus our concerns. In relation to ISDS and small businesses, the Bavarian spar shops in Bavaria have come out against TTIP. They want to be able to sell particular brands, particular types of German meat products that are made in that particular part of Germany, and they don't want them made in Vietnam, and they don't want them made in Mexico, and they don't want them made in America. The German equivalent of ISME has come out against it. And this is because they read the relevant documents that civil society are giving them. And just to give you an example of these investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, 95% of all the money that's been paid in all the world over the last 50 years as a result of these investor-state dispute settlement resolutions have gone to corporations with an annual turnover of more than $100 billion. They have a success rate of 71%. Smaller companies, usually in the around 1 billion annual turnover, have only a success rate of 58%. There is absolutely no evidence provided by the European Commission or by the Irish Government whatsoever to demonstrate how, given that the average cost of an ISDS is $8 million, if we want our jam producer, Mick and Mary's jam producers, right, they get the contract to provide jam to the California Board of Education to put our jam into their schools, and they decide to use an American company instead, and our companies decide, we're a small and medium-sized Irish jam producer, we're going to use, is an Irish company really going to risk $8 million of legal costs to sue the American government because the jam producer from Ireland? No. The ISDS is exclusively a mechanism for multi-billion-dollar corporations. There's many documents have been written by eminent legal scholars showing that ISDS overturns all the principles of democratic accountability. In the European Commission's very detailed proposal for the replacement of ISDS, called the ICS, the Investment Court System, the people who are being asked to go on a panel of arbitrators don't have to have ever practiced as a judge. They have to have the qualifications of being a judge. These are not pan-European rules, so while they may qualify as a judge in Slovenia, they may not qualify as a judge in Ireland. They are then going to be paid, the Commission proposes, €2,000 a month. Do we know any senior legal professionals who survive on $24,000 a year? I think not. Interestingly, if this panel of would-be judges, arbitrators, are called on to be an arbitrator in the ICS dispute, they will be paid $3,000 a day. Again, this overturns a centuries-old idea of the independence of the judiciary, where it doesn't matter a bit to the judge whether the plaintiff or the defendant wins the case. They've got solid, secure, permanent, well-paid positions. And so the proposal of the ISDS from the Commission means that it's in the arbitrator's short-term financial interest to make the case last as long as possible and to make sure the corporations win cases so that more cases will be brought. Additionally, they could be working for a fracking corporation, which is currently suing the Canadian government for banning fracking, in Quebec. They could be doing that 2 weeks ago, and then next week they could be sitting on a panel, being the arbitrator, deciding whether the American company who plans to sue France the minute the TTIP comes in, because France introduced a ban on fracking. And so on 2 weeks ago, they could be arguing as a lawyer for a corporation suing a government for environmental legislation. And then 3 weeks later, they could be acting as an arbitrator in an environmental case. And the only person who's going to be allowed to decide whether there's a conflict of interest or not is a person who's going to be proposed as the president of the ICS, which is a political appointee by the president of the European Commission. And he's going to be the only one who's allowed to decide whether or not this person has a conflict of interest. The other thing that we're missing here completely in this new generation of trade agreements is that it's not about agreements. It's about investment, it's about regulation, it's about democracy. And so we have incredible examples from around the world where Veolia, who operates in the west of Ireland with private business water customers and has a 50% share of the Dublin Lewis, successfully sued the Egyptian government for having the temerity of introducing a minimum wage. It chipped at the last minute back down. We have another example over in Buenos Aires, where the government said, should we give this privatisation a bit of a go with the water? After 2 years it was undrinkable and unaffordable. And the government said, out with you. You have to fix this up. And they said, no, we're not going to fix it. We're a private company. You've no business interfering with us. The government kicked them out of the country anyway, and they successfully sued in an ISDS for $186 million. In relation to developing countries then, we want developing countries to rise to the standards of Europe. Europe is the beacon of light for the world to aspire to. We are not only the most long-lived, well-fed, well-educated, literate people today in the world, but in all of human history. We have the highest workers' protection. We have the highest environmental standards. We have the best public services. Right? We want developing countries to rise to our standards. So if it becomes an unnecessarily restrictive or overly burdensome barrier to trade to insist on high regulations of water quality or workers' rights or banning of particular chemicals, and we're in the business of dumbing down our regulations, how can we ever expect a developing world to have a hope of rising to our level? The United Nations, all the bodies inside the United Nations who have studied this ISDS phenomena in fine detail are vociferous that it overturns the principle of the independent judiciary and it elevates private companies to the status of sovereign states, even to the level of higher than sovereign states, so that when governments are intending to introduce regulations, they have to consider the profits of private companies. And we have loads of examples from around the world where it's overturned that. And if you look very closely, there's a whole range of articles that need to be read in tandem with the ICS proposals from the European Commission. Well, if you take one clause here or one clause there, it looks like governments have the right to regulate. We have the right to regulate, all right. We'll have the right to regulate and then afterwards be sued and pay billions of dollars in compensation for unearned future income that a private company reckons it's not going to earn as a result of the regulations being put in place. Anyway, I could go on, but...
well, there's plenty of opportunity. There are other people to question as well. Mr. Bradley, do you want to come in at this point?
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the Deputy's questions, in terms of European Commission contact, so we've been in correspondence with the Commissioner regarding the report that we produced last July on ISDS and its potential effect on the Irish public policy system. We've also had a meeting with the European Commission here in Dublin, as well as the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation as well, all on the back of that particular report. Just on the question of standards, the report that we produce is very clear on that. It's not a question of if standards will be lowered, it's by how much will they be lowered. And that's really what the question is going to be if this agreement sees the light of day. So, certainly we would have concerns on the public health front. If you look across the water in the UK, there's been a lot of chat about the NHS, for example. So certainly there is a question of a balance here between economy and society and how you get the right balance there and ensure that standards, as Barry said, we're looking to make sure standards are brought up to our level. If we look across the Atlantic, there are situations, particularly in public health, where you have lower standards than there would be over here. So that's a huge concern for us. Just on the economic benefit as well, the report, one bit of it sticks out for me, that Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Curtis did for us, was that after 10 years, the Conservative estimate is that GDP will grow by around 0.2%, and that would be the equivalent of every European being able to buy an additional cup of coffee every week. So there is a concern there in terms of the economic benefit for the people of Europe versus how standards may be cut ultimately.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Senator Quinn.
Thank you. This has been most interesting. I'm delighted you've come in, and the debate itself is very useful. My concern is that the sounds I hear are very negative. Instead of saying, let's find the best way out, and let's temper it and let's adjust it in order to do so, I don't hear those sounds from you in general. I have a fear. There are so many people starving in the world, and yet I hear people saying, no genetically modified organisms. I hear somebody else saying, oh, no fracking. I hear, whatever the developments are, instead of saying, let's find a way to make sure that we can make this work for the benefit of the world's people. I think our objective, and I know Trocaire's objective, is to end poverty. And I think everybody's objective is to do that. But let's make sure that we find a way we can do that. But most of what I hear are people who are saying, oh, let's stop this, let's put a control on it so it doesn't develop on that basis. I think history has shown that we can solve as a word, and you've actually, Barry mentioned it, how Europe, I think it was Barry, how Europe has done very well and set very high standards. We can set those standards, but we won't set those standards unless we're opening our eyes to the opportunities. And I think TTIP does give us a chance to do that. I think it gives us a chance to expand our horizons, to be able to do a very large amount, and to be able to do it in so many different ways. Way back in the 1700s, when the Luddites came in and said, oh, these shoe factories that they're opening up are a disgrace, they're going to put the shoemakers out of business. And they won a very large attention. Now, eventually the shoe factories did come in and did solve it. But I fear that those who are saying, let's put a stop to this, let's not go ahead with it, are actually like those shoemakers back in the 17th or whatever it was century, who said, let's not change. So I believe we should be looking in a different direction. I think Owen Bradley has certainly looked in a different direction. I think there's little doubt that tobacco is just outrageous, and whatever step has to be taken to make sure that we control tobacco has to be taken. But I don't see that as part of this, of TTIP. I think we've got to find a solution, but we've to do it by starting in a positive way rather than a negative way.
Thank you. Senator Quinn, anybody like to come in on that? Ms Ellen?
Thank you, Senator Quinn. I don't think any of us are anti what we would see as progress, and I absolutely agree with your sentiments that all of us would like to find a way. In fact, in some ways it's rather ironic to hear me arguing against regulation when I spent a lot of my energy for the last 20-25 years arguing for regulation proportionate to the risk involved, and that's not that isn't and that the cost of compliance doesn't put people out of business and so on. So I'm not at all against what is supposedly the spirit of this. But, you know, it's very, very hard to find any one of the points that we've made there today that you could really argue in favour of. And I just wonder, I don't know whether I'm allowed to ask Senator Quinn a question or not. I'm not. Oh, I see, right. I was wondering if you had any solutions yourself.
We want to get information from you.
I thought that was the purpose of today, that you would be able to...
Well, I'll meet you outside.
We'd like to come in, Ms Gold.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that I would say that the perceived negativity is probably because of the fact that there is such deep concern over the scale and the secrecy that has come about as a result of TTIP negotiations. In relation to poverty, yes, it's obviously the stated objective of Trocaire is to reduce poverty and to create a more just world. But I think that TTIP for us, the biggest threat of all is in relation to how we handle climate change. Because climate change is now the single biggest threat to addressing poverty. Ban Ki-moon came to Ireland last year and he said, if you want to be a leader on hunger, you have to be a leader on climate change. And tackling climate change obviously entails a number of things in terms of mitigating our emissions. But it can be essentially boiled down to one thing, which is we need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels and on the fossil fuel industry. We need to drastically reduce our emissions in a very rapid way. And we've signed up to doing that through the Paris Agreement just before Christmas. How TTIP interlinks with those stated objectives to me, creates some serious dilemmas in terms of policy coherence and our policy objectives. Because we know that tackling climate change means regulating and reducing the influence of the fossil fuel industry. And we know also that the energy chapter, and Barry could speak in more detail about it, in TTIP would lock in investments for increasing fossil fuel and climate change for the next 30 years. So there's a very deep contradiction between our stated objectives to reduce poverty and mitigate climate change and TTIP. We also know from Trocaire's long experience that ending poverty, above all, is about enhancing the state's capacity and democratic accountability. And we see TTIP as, if it's taken as a gold standard for international trade, for all the reasons that have been outlined, it reduces the democratic accountability and the capacity for state action in third countries, or it will do. So we see that if countries are locked into a system where through ISDS, when it becomes the norm, they are not able to increase their standards to, in a sense, rise to the standards of European levels. How are people who are currently living in poverty meant to work their way out of poverty? Because we see TTIP as undermining many of the international standards that are already in place.
Thank you, Ms Gold. Mr Finnegan.
I couldn't agree more, Senator Quinn. If we read the 9-page mandate, which took an incredible amount of lobbying and the threat of legal action by our own Emily O'Reilly over in Brussels, eventually the Commission released the mandate that the 28 ministers gave them. And it's a very negative document. And the Commission went into these TTIP negotiations with the express intention of ending government monopolies, forcing the privatisation of public services and getting rid of what they call non-tariff barriers. We do have a very good system to help trade. It's called democracy. And the non-tariff barriers are the laws and regulations that we as a society have put in place to protect ourselves. And my understanding of democracy is that the rules and regulations that govern their interactions between people and companies reflect the values of the people. And I believe it's quite clear if we read the 9-page mandate for the negotiations of the TTIP that the TTIP is set against these values. And so when we sound negative, it's because the starting position is that the regulations and laws are bad because they interfere with private profit. We say the regulations and laws are good because they defend consumer rights, they defend environmental protection, and they allow a competitive business environment to operate. And if we think about what happened to poor Luddites, there they were living in little villages, making shoes and family-owned businesses, with children running around, learning the skills of their fathers, people in charge of their own destinies, deciding when to work and when not to work, sustainable community-based businesses. And then hell on earth came with these gargantuan 10-storey factories where children's arms were chopped off, where there was no safety regulations, where workers who spoke out were beaten, where pregnant women did happy lifting, when life expectancy was reduced from the late 60s down to the late 20s, mid-30s. And that's what mechanisation did. And so what we did in the 1800s in Europe, we had this wonderful idea of the Enlightenment. Let's have policy-based, evidence-based policy making. And let's use the democratic vote to protect people in their work environment. The entire objective of TTIP is to get rid of those rules and regulations that protect the quality of work and the quality of our consumer goods. And so if we come across as negative, it's because we're against that and we're for democracy.
Mr. Bradley, would you like to comment?
Yeah, just to very much welcome the comments by Senator Quinn. Just in terms of the, as Barry and Lorna have alluded to, in terms of the perceived negativity coming from ourselves, certainly the report that the Cancer Society has produced is designed to be very constructive. So not only do we say we recommend that the ISDS be removed from the agreement, but we say if an ISDS or an investment court system happens, these following principles should happen. And ultimately, as I said at the outset, we're not against trade. We understand that trade happens. We just want to protect public health. And I think that's going to be very important. And you touched on the cornerstone, which is tobacco as well. And I very much welcome what you said. But I think tobacco kind of sums up the issues around ISDS, particularly for ourselves. And I think it showcases the reasons why we are arguing for a public health carve-out to protect public health policy from an ICS. And the reason for that, it's summed up very much so by David Sullivan, who is the EU ambassador in the US, was over here before Christmas. And when he was asked about the potential tobacco industry lobbying and potential use of ISDS, he very much said, look, that's not going to happen under TTIP. But about 5 minutes later, he said, I'm afraid what might happen is that there might be some very constructive lawyers, is the phrase that he used, who may interpret or, as the case may be, misinterpret the final agreement around TTIP. And that we would share that concern as well. So ultimately, we would like to see that public health carve-out and to protect public health policies from that particular industry as well.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Any further questions? Deputy Jobin, did you want to come back again?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Laura, I didn't see that.
Yeah, thanks very much. Sometimes I get a bit confused because I followed this debate for the last year and a half, and one of the key things that have come out that I've listened to is the standards that have been set in Europe are the standards of the product, the standard which should be the product coming in from the US. It should be of that standard. And that has been clearly, because I come from a farming background, so any US product, and there was always a fear that, particularly on the meat side, that we would get the hormonal beef, and I think from what I've listened to over the last year and a half, that our standards here, which we have set, and unfortunately across Europe, and Darina, you might know this, that you could go into a market in France and a country market in Ireland, and there's two different types of standards that we have set in this country. We've taken the higher end of the standards. I heard you speaking before with regard to the regulation, and that sometimes we are over-regulated, and the small man who would butcher a few sheep in it is actually regulated out of it, whereas in France and places like that, he wouldn't be as regulated. So we have to look at ourselves within our own country too, as well, as to where we set. We probably sometimes set impossible standards for our own, even though we're talking about us as being an origin green, and we do like to trade amongst ourselves too, as possible. So I'm a bit confused in that, in the fact that, from my reading of it, that the standards that we have here in Europe are the standards by which trade will be done with the US under this TTIP. The second thing, and I would sort of agree with the second point I just want to ask Darina is, have you difficulty with your own produce that you produce getting into the US currently at the moment? And and lastly, I often wonder what the discussions, I was probably too young, with regard to us going into the EU, and what was the discussions going on at the time. This would mean Senator Quinn might know better. And
72, and it was the EEC.
EEC, yeah. But there was discussions going on for about 5 years beforehand, and I often wonder what would the outcome have been if we were that negative, about going into the EU, and we didn't go in. My father often spoke to me about the economic war and the hardship that brought on this country. I look at this as an opportunity, but we have to be careful with the opportunity. But we have to make sure that the opportunity is there, because there are I was in a school this morning in Leixlip, and I saw young kids on the IT side of things, and I saw them producing little videos, games, and I was thoroughly enlightened by the fact that here we have a future generation, and are we going to curtail them to not being able to trade with the world? And I would worry that if we're going to come out as totally against this, that we will curtail a future generation. And I know, I listened to where you're on the climate change, that we have to protect a future generation. I've been to Africa so many times. I've worked as a volunteer in various parts around the world. And I do believe trade is a way of helping people to get out of that poverty that Trocaire talk about, and I've seen it firsthand. But if we keep putting up stronger and stronger barriers, it means that difficulty is going to create long-term poverty in certain areas, but also create less opportunities for those kids I saw this morning in schools. So I'm of an opinion that we have to look at this much more carefully, but we also have to embrace the fact that we are in a global world now, and trade is done on a global basis. And I would like to see that small farmer who can kill his few lambs in his abattoir and allow that young fella that opportunity in 20 years' time to be able to expand globally. But I'd also like to see African trade coming in here. So we have to look at this on a global scale, but also, as I say, I think we have to embrace it, but be careful about what we're embracing.
Thank you. Ms. Allen.
With a lot of what you say there, and I think, just in case any misunderstanding, I think I can speak for everybody. And I say there's no way we're against trade, or indeed, and actually, really, I think, but with the EU we have a wonderful record of very high standard in terms of regulation and so on. I might disagree with the severity of some of it, but in fact what's really being proposed is that we dumb down our regulations in a whole lot of different areas. We're not just talking about food, we're talking about labour laws and all sorts of other areas to actually coincide with the American regulations, which are less stringent in many, many areas. And so we're arguing against that. And also in the case of beef, for example, which and we are export so much of our beef and dairy and all of that. So basically we would be competing then with our higher standards in Europe. We would be competing with the US farmers and food producers who actually are producing food to a much lower standard than we are here. And they simply can't compete on economies of scale in terms of price and so on. So that would be really, really extraordinarily difficult for Irish agriculture and all of that. So there's that whole area there. And by the way, thank you for giving me the credit, but I actually don't make the Ballymaloe relish, which I think you're probably referring to. It's my sister-in-law. We're a big family, and it is indeed for sale in the US, and there haven't been, you know, it went through all of the various things, and there haven't been any difficulties there, and so on.
Mr. Finnegan?
Yeah. Absolutely, I fully agree with the values that you've set out there, Deputy. In relation to small farmers, this trade deal has nothing to do with small farmers except to make life more difficult for them. You look at how many head of cattle are in sheds in America. There's literally sheds there with 100,000 animals in them, right? And the safety standards and the health standards that they have over there are just very, very, very low in comparison to our standards.
Yeah. The fact, my understanding is that the standards we have here are the standards of what the beef or any product that come into this country have to meet. There's no, I haven't heard of a dumbing down of the standards.
That's what's proposed.
Sorry, no crossing over now. We'll just allow the answers, please. Thank you.
Yes, the whole idea of TTIP is the reverse of that. If you read what the meat industry, and don't forget in America, like there's 4 companies control the beef, 3 companies control chicken, I think it's 3 companies control mutton and lamb, and that's the way. The objective of this trade agreement is to do that, because it's viewed as inefficient to have so many small farmers, and that. So you get this capital-intensive industry, where to get into the industry, you need huge amounts of money. You need to, because the animals are in such unhygienic conditions, you need to inject them with an endless amount of antibiotics and an endless amount of hormones. And so you're spending a lot of money on creating, basically your end unit cost is much lower to produce a kilo of beef in America than it is here, right? And if you look at what these meat industry lobbyists and the position of the American government is that as far as they're concerned is our rules and regulations with the high standards, that's the problem. The problem that the Americans have is our high standards. And the objective of TTIP is to sweep those high standards away and to create one of 2 things. One is harmonisation, where everybody comes down to the same level, or recognition. Now, this is coming straight from the European Commission, it's coming straight from the negotiators, and it is the stated objective. So it's going to be one of 2 things, whether it's workers' rights or chemical regulation or food standards or animal husbandry standards. Or there's a twin track, they're going to go for one or the other. Harmonisation is everybody ends up at the same level. The other one is recognition, where we keep our high standards, they keep their low standards, we recognise each other, and they can sell their capital-intensive, low-unit cost, chemical-filled food products in our shelves, and we can't ban it. Also, what they object to is being able to test their food. So, for example, you get a container ship full of wheat, and it says regular wheat, not GMO. Right now, our inspectors have the right to, we'll have a wee test of that. We have numerous examples where not only wheat, but meat products and other grains have been found to contain GMOs, when in fact the producer said they don't. We won't be allowed to do that anymore. There'll be no second testing. The idea is to reduce the cost to industry, so to not have 2 sets of standards. So in America they have what they call a scientific method, which involves a private company hiring scientists, no peer-reviewed research, no sharing of data between scientists, even inside the same company, and voluntary regulation where the government doesn't do its own testing. What we're then expected to do in Europe is to trust a huge multi-billion-dollar corporation that they've done all the testing and that they've told the truth, when the evidence shows us that we have a lot of evidence to show that the products that end up in Europe aren't what they say on the label. And it's not about everything meeting European standards. It's the absolute opposite, unfortunately. And this is why there's such massive opposition from farmers' lobby groups, from the slow food movement, from Eurotokes, from all the people that are concerned in the industry about high-quality food in Europe. They're absolutely up in arms about this because the stated explicit objective is 1, harmonisation of standards, or 2, recognition. I'll just give one brief example that's related to standards and also jobs and employment. In Europe, there are 1,328 chemicals that we have banned from the use of cosmetics because, as far as we're concerned, using the precautionary principle of science, we reckon they cause cancer and other heinous diseases. In America, how many chemicals are banned from cosmetics? 11. So the objective is that this chemical-filled hairspray, mascara, lipstick, whatever it is, that they will be for sale on our shelves and we won't be able to ban it. And so then what are European food producers and European cosmetics producers going to do is they'll go, well, I'm not staying here with these high standards. I'm going to move my capital to the USA and I'm going to manufacture it there where wages, pay and conditions are lower, where regulation is purely done by the corporation and not by the government. And then I'm going to sell my product back to Europe. So we're going to end up with less jobs manufacturing on a whole range of things. The jobs go to America, the production gets done there, there's more chemicals used, and it's sold back over here without being regulated and tested. And this is what has happened all over the world with these similar free trade agreements, the biggest one being NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, where American agriculture was decimated. Decimated. Tens of thousands of jobs lost. There's been a 236% increase in agricultural exports from Mexico to the USA, and a huge reduction in American agricultural exports to Mexico. So what the lads producing food in the USA did when NAFTA, the free trade agreement that's very like this, came in 95, was like, we're shutting up shop here producing chickens and beef and we're going across the border to Mexico. Wages, pay and conditions are lower, there's no government inspections, off we go. And that's what we're talking about. And I think we need to recognise that the voices from the quality food industry and the quality food civil society, both in America and Europe, are speaking with one voice. And in the USA, the small quality food producers and the high food quality food trade unions and other standards civil society groups that were given out stink about NAFTA in 95, everything they said came true. And they're still there today, 20 years later, saying exactly the same points about this trade deal. So it's important to read what civil society have to say, get our head around the arguments that we're making, and burrow more deeply into the details of the Commission's documents and move past the marketing bump that's coming out from the press releases.
Did you want to make this point?
Well, just very briefly, to sum up the Deputy's argument, if I have him correctly, is that there's huge opportunity with this, but we have to be careful. And I'd fully agree with that. The issue that we have had, and I'm sure people here would agree with me, is that we don't see that reflected in the Minister's position as well. So we'd like to see the Minister talk about not only the opportunities that TTIP offer, which he does so, but also the potential issues and problems that may arise with it as well. He is a signatory to that letter that was sent calling for the incoming Trade Commissioner, Commissioner Malmstrom, to introduce ISDS within TTIP, forgetting about the issues that around public health and around agriculture as well. So what I would like to see is for the Minister to acknowledge those particular issues that we're talking about. Because at this moment in time, his speech last Thursday in the Dáil Chamber, providing a very good example, it focuses purely on the economic brief. And I understand that, given that he is Minister for Jobs, Enterprise, Innovation, but the issues around TTIP are much greater than that. So we'd like to see the Minister acknowledge that there are issues around it as well.
Thank you. Ms Gold.
Yes, I'd just like to bring us back to the impacts on developing countries and the relationship between TTIP and poverty reduction after Deputy Lawler's comments. I think my first remark would be that I think that the whole challenge of climate change trumps this discussion, and that we have to recognise that unless we have the state capacity to mitigate against climate change, we're going to see a reduction in yields of up to 50% globally.